developed the art of storytelling. Her name was Enid. Now perhaps you're thinking of Enid Blyton, that famous storyteller of children. But this wasn't that Enid. This Enid was Enid the dramatist, Enid the actress, Enid the teacher, and Enid who was pretty famous amongst the hill tribes of Lesotho, as it happened. This Enid was my grandmother. On golden evenings, she would draw the curtains, there she is, she would draw the curtains across and the light would be shining through. And I could see her silhouetted as she'd come and she'd sit on the side of my bed. And she'd tell me stories of the dragons in the caverns of Carnarvon.
And the old lady who was a higgledy-piggledy lady who used to fish on the side of the mountain cliffs for cockles and mussels, and she'd crunch them and make spells.
But the stories I loved most of all were the stories that she told me of her life and times in Africa. The true stories of when she was working for Save the Children. Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Lusaka, Zambia, they were kind of like incantations in my mind, these places. One night she said to me, "Have I ever told you about the secrets of storytelling?" Every month, the food and the tools and the equipment would arrive from all over the world, and we'd pack it in our rusty old Jeep. And then we'd set off, sometimes for days, and one time we set off for 4 days and 4 nights over a rocky path, and we'd sleep under the stars every night. And then we arrived amongst the tribes, and they invited us in. And they sat us around the fire, and we shared stories. They invited us to tell us tales of our conurbations and our buildings and our televisions and our lives in the West. And they shared stories about their lives. And what we discovered was we were more similar than we were different. Because what the stories were about were the loves and the losses and the people that we were. But we discovered something else through them, that these stories conveyed messages and knowledge like nothing else. And so we used that, and we started to go from tribe to tribe, sharing their stories, and they sometimes created plays where they could share stories on education, on irrigation, on medicine, on how to work as a tribe and a community. We discovered the power of messages in stories. Now, my grandmother must have planted a seed in me. There's a children's game called Grandmother's Footsteps, and I think that she had created some sort of footsteps for me to follow. And I didn't realise it for a long time. That kind of image of storytelling stayed with me. I mean, a lot of people have this idea of tribes around the fire. But actually, storytelling is something that's important in the modern day context all the time. I mean, just think of all the bedazzle that goes on around, is it King of Thrones? Ring of Thrones? Game of Thrones. Yes, or whatever the latest box set is. People will just be gripped and they'll dedicate hours and hours of their time to hearing stories. We have stories around the water cooler, gossip, films, programs. We just share stories all the time to convey our knowledge, because stories are wonderful vehicles and metaphors to hold a piece of complex information and convey it to somebody else. And one of the times in my life that really taught me that storytelling is relevant as well in business was when I was working at EY and I was running an event for Senior Head of Tax. He's become now the Global Head of Tax. And we were sitting in a glass office constructing an event. And we said, right, okay, this event is going to be about risk, and we want to really attract some senior figures across financial service to this risk event. So why don't we kind of have this idea where sometimes the greatest risk of all is to not take a risk. So I took a risk and I said, well, Chris, how about you take a risk and you share a story about when you didn't take a risk, and the cost, the implication of it. And to my surprise, he said yes. And so the day of the event arrived, and Chris stood at the front of the room, and he said, many years ago when I was at Oxford, I was having a great time. I was doing really well academically, I had a great social life, and I was doing well in my athletics. But I had a secret. And this secret started to weigh heavily on me. It was a secret I didn't want to tell even my parents, not a soul, not my friends, nobody. And as I continued with my studies, they started to deteriorate. And I continued to go to the athletics pitch and I'd run around, but one day I collapsed in training. And my coach picked me up and took me to the little study, and he said to me, "Chris, what the hell's going on?" And I said to him, after a bit of thought, "I've got cancer." And he said, "You stupid boy, why didn't you tell me? You've got to go and tell your tutor, we can organise your life around this, you've got to go home and tell your parents and get better." And suddenly it was as if a huge weight had been lifted off me. I'd spent all that time keeping my secret, and my life had been deteriorating around me, and once I told people about it, I was able to reconstruct my life, and I'm happy to say I did get better. And I went back and I got my first class degree, and I got my colours on the athletics track. And I recognised that sometimes the greatest risk of all is to not take a risk. So after this event, I went up to one of the people who had been invited to the event, one of the clients, and this was a key client that Chris had been courting for years, really. And I said, "What did you think of today's event?" And he said, "It was unlike any other event I've ever attended. I've known Chris for a long time, but I didn't actually know him. And so I didn't really know what he was made of. And as a result, I didn't really know whether I could trust him. But what happened is, after he told his story, not only did everybody else start to share their own experiences of risk, and we all got to know one another a lot better, but I trust him so much more, and you can guarantee some business is going to come his way now." And so, there are some commercial implications for sharing stories. It's valuable. But the real turning point for me was when I was working, I was there to coach people at a senior civil servants conference at the MOD. And my role was to help them coach for their leadership presentations for the different areas that they were in charge of. And so I turned up and I sat down and I listened to my first cohort tell their prepared leadership speech. Now, we've all heard slick speeches, we've all heard professional speeches, and these guys were as slick as they come. And I sat there going, what am I going to say to them? These guys are brilliant, they are brilliant speakers. But then as I listened, I noticed something was missing. It was making sense, but it wasn't getting me. And I started to say, why does this matter to you? You're saying, you're making a point, you're saying it matters, but why? I want to understand. Tell us something about who you are, what your motivation is. Open up. Could you say something personal? Because the first thing somebody is thinking in the audience when somebody gets up on stage is, who is this person? The second thing they're thinking is, what are they going to tell us? And the third thing is, what am I going to get out of it? Is there anything in it for me? But the very first thing is, who is this person? And so, as I started to ask these questions, somebody stood up. I mean, these guys were senior. We had one guy whose thing was Sir Air Force Field Marshal Bull. The name badge was so wide, it was practically going off the side of their body. And then you'd have somebody else who, actually, the permanent secretary was one of the people. So they were great. They were people who were very high-ranking. And then this guy who was a bit more junior than the rest stood up and talked about being in theatre of war, and he talked about his experiences being on watch, and he talked about how proud and how important it was to know that he was part of the greatest military service in the world, because he knew he was equipped in the right way and he could depend on his equipment and the other people around. And then he made his point, and his point really brought it home. And so we know that that's important. But what I want to share with you, I'm behind my slides, so I've just realised my army slides here. We know it through our own experience. We know it anecdotally, but there is some neuroscience to prove it as well. And there have been quite a lot of studies, but one of them is to show that when we receive information alone, only two parts of our brain get stimulated, Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which are to do with language processing. When we hear a story, it's a whole brain experience. So what happens is, there's been some research into mirror neurons. It's still under question, but with mirror neurons, what will happen is that when people speak about an experience like skiing down a mountain, as they're reliving the experience and talking about what they're seeing and physically feeling, the other people in the audience will kind of reflect on that, and some parts of their body will be stimulated in the same way. So that's how mirror neurons work. But of course, other aspects, when we talk about all of our senses, get stimulated. And so storytelling is very powerful, and it means that when we tell a story, it's far more memorable. It's been shown that a track of text is 6 times more memorable when it's with the facts in it, and 6 times more memorable when told in story form than just as a list. 6 times. You know, it's significant. It makes a huge difference. What difference does this make when you're trying to convey information, have an impact, be memorable, have people on side, have people emotionally moved, have people connect with you, have people understand your message? So, what about these 7 C's then? Well, I'm a lover of the ocean, and I've always sailed. Since I was a baby, my poor mother was forced to cross the channel with 2 young babies and change our nappies while we were going through a storm in the sea. And needless to say, she eventually divorced my father. It wasn't this sailing thing. We then went on to live in Hong Kong, and we sailed around the South China Sea. And but nothing prepared me for when I found myself midway between Fiji and New Zealand in a zone that is known as a sort of second Bermuda Triangle. And as I was in the... Are you a sailor? No, I could... I got that sense. You were kind of nodding like you knew that horrific area. I mean, the way we got caught in the middle of a storm, and our boat, which was 40 feet long, was just going vertically up a wave. We get to the top, and then we go crash on the other side. And every now and again, the skipper would pop his head up and go, "Stop slamming the bloody boat!" And I'd be there behind the wheel. The autopilot was broken. On my watch, my 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Now, when we have 4 hours off, it's not off. It's tumbling around down below, trying to tidy up, trying to cook for other people, trying to find your clothes, and you're wet and you're soggy, and you don't bother changing, and you feel sick. And I felt seasick for 7 days and 7 nights. People said, "Oh, it'll abate after a day or 2. No. I was sick the whole time. It probably didn't help that when we left Fiji, I'd had a few rum and cokes the night before, so I set sail with a hangover. But we left this lovely blue ocean, and out we went, and then the storm hit. And it was horrible. And in fact, I started to hallucinate, because I was so tired. My bunk had a water drip like a Chinese torture that would go down on my head, and it would keep me awake. And I started to visualise a helicopter land next to us, and a Mexican cleaning lady got off, and she took all our laundry and she cleaned it for us. But, you know, I survived. And when we started to see New Zealand, the land just appearing as a dark shape in the distance, and then we spent another 8 hours sailing alongside it and finally arrived in Auckland Bay, I suddenly realised what it was like for those many sailors over the years who went around the world and really had a sense of the geography of the world. They didn't just get in an aeroplane and suddenly turn up in a hot country that's completely different. There was this sort of gradual feeling, and we really felt we earned it. We had arrived, and we came in, we chucked all our meat overboard, because you're not allowed to arrive with any frozen meat, so that probably encouraged the sharks. We did that, and then we arrived in Auckland Harbour, and we had got there. And stories can be like that sometimes. They can be pretty horrific in the middle, and they should be. There should be some sort of challenge or struggle, but they only really count when you bring the goods home. You've got to arrive. And so I've travelled since around the Baltic, across the Atlantic. It wasn't nearly as bad as those 7 days. It took us 3 weeks, but I just wore a bikini, and it was hot, and we sailed across, and I was a deckhand in the Caribbean, and ended up in Lithuania in a hospital eating gruel, sailing the Baltic. I've sailed many oceans, but what I've discovered as I've crossed the 7 seas is that all the stories people tell have certain things in common, and we can inspire with these stories in 7 ways, and this is what I call the 7 C's. See what I did there? Okay. So, these slides, by the way, are courtesy of Dave Henson, if anyone wants their slides done. So I think he's into his groovy graphics. So the 7 C's, these are ways that you can inspire. So the first one is connection. You can use your story to connect, or you can tell a connection story. So a story that I often tell is about how my father would sometimes be on cooking duty. He had one dish, scrambled eggs. I wasn't a fan of his scrambled eggs. So one night I thought I'd be quite diplomatic, and I said, Dad, I've got a little problem. You see, I don't actually like yellow food. Nothing to do with scrambled eggs, I just don't like yellow food. And he said, don't worry. And without missing a beat, he presented my scrambled eggs. With some pink food colouring in it. So I use this story at the beginning of when I'm running a workshop on influencing people. And I use this as a connection just to say, how my early attempts at influencing were a little bit poor. And connecting stories are often stories which you use perhaps when you were a child, so other people can relate to childhood stories, or it might be about when you started in a similar role to those people that you're talking to. There's stories about some of the foibles, some of the mistakes you made, some of the things you got wrong. So there's a sort of connection story. The next one we've got is a story around establishing your credibility. So far more effective to use a story which drops in some of your credibility than it is to kind of use some sort of a CV. And I learned this the kind of hard way, because I once came to give a workshop, and I stood up, and one of my slides had lots of businesses that I'd worked for, all the logos. And so I kind of went, I did this, and I've done that, and I've done the other, aren't I great? And at the end of it, somebody came up to me and said, actually, you established your credibility when you got up to speak. You had the assumed credibility, but when you started grappling for it and trying to prove it, it kind of took the sheen off it a little bit. So instead, use a story. Drop in something that you've done within the context of the story. You don't need to say, you don't need to spell it out. So the next one is context. Stories give a context for how we think about things. So one example of this with you, leaping ahead, is with Steve Jobs. When he unveiled the iPad, the tablet had already been around for 10 years, but he gave it context by telling a story about how it was in the perfect place between, it was the missing link, if you like, between those that had a phone that they could carry around with them, and those that had a laptop which had a big enough screen to do all the stuff that you want to do. But if you have both of those things, you're obviously missing something. You want something you can carry around, and it kind of does both of those things. And so, of course, everybody went out and bought it. So you can use your stories to position things, to give them context, to show how they're valuable, to show how they matter. And then, of course, you've already seen this, I've already given the spoiler away, but you can use stories to convince people and to create conviction. So you see this all the time with, at the moment there are a lot of stories around environmental issues and campaigns, and so stories might be scare stories around how things are going to develop. Nelson Mandela, the story of Nelson Mandela was what really gave huge conviction to his intention to have a peaceable solution to apartheid in South Africa, because of his background story being in prison. So because he had been in prison, and he had every right to be angry and to, hate apartheid and to want to campaign against it, he could still hate it, but he could do it in a peaceable way. In fact, he said, "As I walked out towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew that if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." He had to drop his old story, his old narrative, and take on a new narrative. And his conviction around that led a whole nation into a new way of peace. And it was very believable. You can use your story to create a sense of collaboration. So, we've got Churchill, "We shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the trenches, and we shall never surrender." And we the people, is used 12 times in the American Constitution. In Barack Obama's address, he used "we the people" to echo that sense of we-ness, and he used "we" 100 times, at least 100 times. I don't have to check on my facts actually, but there were just hundreds of times that he used "we", because it creates that sense of who are we as a collective. So you can tell a group story and you can get people on board. This is who we are, this is who we become. You can do that in a corporate context. You can do it if you want to get people on side for some campaign that you're after. But you tell a story about who are we as people. We are strong people, we are wise people, we are people who care. We are speakers, and what do we do as speakers? We can create that kind of mythology around it. And of course, we can use story to catalyse action, to inspire action. So it can motivate people to act. Save the Children, my grandmother worked for, found that when they released an app which just asked for funds, they got 3.5 times the amount when they used a story. So when they just showed a single person rather than just said thousands and millions of people are starving, help Imani, she's not going to see her next meal. And you see that a lot with charities. But they can catalyse us to action in other ways. So this young fella is called Jess Martin, and he's just sailed around the world. He was the youngest person, he's 18, just turned 18, youngest person to sail around the world. And this photograph was seen by a young lad called Michael sitting at breakfast. Michael saw the photograph, he was 14 years old, and he thought, I'm going to beat that record. He didn't have a boat, he didn't have the money, but he decided he was going to do it. And off he went, and he started to save. And this is him 2 weeks before his 18th birthday. And he became the youngest person to sail around the world. So they can catalyse action. And finally, they can build community. So you can cultivate a community with stories by pulling out the identity that people can share. So we've got again, an Apple ad. This is their Think Different campaign. Does anyone remember this? So they had all kinds of different types of people with these images, and it just said Think Different. And they're promoting the idea that, you know, an Apple user is someone who is an original thinker. And I love the kind of irony that they're saying, you know, you're all not the same. It's like the life of Brian. Think differently. And then they would list their manifesto next to it. So, you know, you probably read it. Here's the crazy ones, the misfits, the troublemakers. You know, while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. So you can create your own community, your own manifesto for who your customers are, and you can tell a story about who your customers are and who you are. So there are the 7 C's. You can also use these as a framework. You could use all 7 of them if you really wanted to go for broke. Here's an example of Adam, who is a banker. This is a story or a communication he gave using stories within this framework, using all 7. He is a diversity and inclusion champion, and he was standing up to speak to people who were in diversity and inclusion. And so he started by saying, you may wonder what a white, middle-aged, middle-class man is doing here talking to you about diversity and inclusion. And you may notice that I come from Wales, and there's not much diversity in Wales. I mean, there's sheep, and there's rugby players. But I'm stereotyping. There's a lot of diversity in sheep and rugby players. And we don't want to stereotype. But when I first left Wales from my small village, I came up to London and I went to work in the city. And I went to work for Hambros Bank, which was one of the oldest banks in the city, peopled with old Etonians and old Harrovians and old school-tired people, and I didn't fit in. But they saw something in me and they gave me a chance. And I discovered that there were other people that had different ways of thinking as well. It wasn't just one monoculture. In fact, I had to put up with my fair share of teasing, but so did other people. People would call me a sheep shagger, and I'd have to laugh it off, and I'd just go, well, is that the best you can do? So I have experienced some prejudice in that way. But I'm really keen on diversity and inclusion, and it started when I was a young boy, because I really did know the only gay in the village. He was my godfather. And my godfather lived in London with his partner, and sometimes we would go up to London and we'd be exposed to a very different way of thinking from all the people in our village back in Wales. In fact, one day I was sitting there, I was about 15 or 16 years old, and I was sitting at a dinner party drinking some amazing wine, sitting next to the curator of the Tutankhamun exhibition. And I thought, wow, there's a whole world out there, a world that's so different from my own life. And so I'm passionate about different types of people with different ways of thinking. I know what value it can do. I know that when we work together and have different perspectives, we have something so much greater than when it's just a monoculture, when people just think in the same way. And so what I ask of you all today is to start taking action to find out about different people, but also to share your own stories of difference. Don't try to be the same as everyone else. Talk about what makes you unique. Be courageous and confident in your difference. And together we can build up a community and a group of people that is much richer for its diversity. So that was a way of pulling it all together in a framework. I've stopped being the Welsh guy now. Sorry, I couldn't do the Welsh accent. It would have been better. But let's go back to your story now. So your story, where do you start? You need a key message or a key point that you're trying to convey to give it a focus. And this is almost like 101 for storytelling, but we often forget to do it. And that is to ask ourselves these 3 questions. KFD. What do you think KFD stands for? Kentucky Fried Dromedary. No, well, actually, it stands for, what do you want your audience as a result of? Know, feel and do. You've got it. What do you want them to know, feel and do? So ask yourself those questions before any talk. What do you want them to know as a result of hearing you speak? What do you want them to feel? What's the visceral feeling you want them to have? How do you want them to be moved? And by using your story, you're much more likely to get those feelings happening. And then what action do you want them to take? What do you want them to do as a result? And when you've got those 3, you can kind of boil it all down into your key message or your key phrase. And that can act as your focus all the way through, your key message, which you know up front, you might link to it all the way through, and you know at the end. So, I want you to know that your stories hinge around those moments, and that your stories are powerful. I want you to feel excited by that. I want you to feel as though you really want to explore those moments and understand the meaning you've made of them. And what I want you to do is, when you've explored them, take them and start using them in new ways. Sort of open up a little bit and be vulnerable, like Chris was in that speech he made about taking a risk. Take some risks to show your vulnerability and open up, because when you do, people will connect with you and they'll engage with you so much more. So, we, back to the old saying, the dromedary in a boat. How do we get to our story? Well, if anyone here knows about sailing, you know that there's one place you can never sail. Does anyone know where that is?
On the land.
Oh, we can't sail on the... Oh, I suppose you could sail on the sand.
Straight into the wind.
Straight into the wind, absolutely. Are you a sailor? Yeah. So an easy question. You can never sail straight into the wind. So what do you have to do instead?
Sack.
Yes. So stories are a little bit like that. It would be very boring if you just kind of went straight there. You need the jeopardy. You need the problems. Are they going to make it to the end? What are the ups? What are the downs? What are the ups? What are the downs? And then they finally get there. But what's also important is that you locate those pivotal moments upon which things hinge and change. What happened just before and what happened just after in that moment. So you sort of start with your identity, who you were originally. Once, this isn't a true story, but as an example, I used to love ballet, and I was 5 years old, and I'd do ballet all the time, and it was really great, and I wanted to become a ballet dancer. But then one day, I felt I was being teased, so I gave up ballet. Oh, can't stop this. So I broke my ankle, so then I got better, I took up tap, and then got teased, didn't do it, and then I met someone who's a ballroom champion who invited me to be their partner, and now we're ballroom champs. So, you kind of have, and that's the story of how you became a ballroom dancer. So you can kind of use this method, this is what I call the zigzag method, where you actually think of the story, think of a passion that you've got, something that you love. And in fact, I think we've got some time to explore this.